The wind bit at her cheeks like a pack of wolves, and Mary Ann Collins hugged her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, counting the hours by the sounds of the sparse town. Christmas. Eve had come with a bitter sting in the air that seemed to reach down to the marrow, and the little settlement of Dry Creek was no refuge from hunger or misery. She had arrived at the mail-order office weeks before, clutching the thin envelope that promised a future she could hardly imagine. A home, a husband, a life where she wouldn't have to scrape out each day from the dust and dirt of some endless prairie. The man who was supposed to meet her, a certain rancher named Boone Hartley, had failed to show, and now for 3 days she had been left alone in a boarding room that smelled faintly of mothballs and stale bread. She had gone without supper for 2 nights, swallowing her tears with the dry crumbs of a biscuit, wishing she could vanish from the world entirely. Mary Ann had never known fear so absolute. It wasn't the wolves in the hills, or the freezing nights that haunted her. It was the emptiness of the small town, the echoing silence when she went to the saloon and no one recognized her. No one asked where she was from or if she was hungry. People had noticed the letter she carried, the promise of a mail-order bride, but they looked away, too wary of trouble, too caught up in their own lonely lives. She had tried to make herself small, invisible, listening to the occasional laughter or the slap of boots against the boardwalk outside, praying she would not be asked questions she could not answer. The very thought of food made her stomach twist into knots, for it had become a symbol of hope that never arrived. At night she heard the wind whip through the cracks of the walls and imagined Boone Hartley riding in from the hills, his coat dusted with snow, hat low over his eyes. She imagined him tipping the brim and saying something simple, "Evening, ma'am," and offering her shelter and warmth. But each dawn brought only the same cruel emptiness, the same gnawing ache that had settled into her bones. Her body ached for nourishment, but more than that, her soul ached for someone to notice, for someone to act. She tried to sleep, curling into herself under thin blankets, listening to the creak of the floorboards and the distant howls, imagining the loneliness in every shadow. The night dragged on with relentless patience. She heard voices outside, men arguing in low tones, the kind of voices that carried menace rather than cheer. She pressed herself against the window and peered out. Figures moved in the snow, their hats low, guns slung over their shoulders, and she realized with a spike of terror that she had nowhere to run. The wind carried a sense of impending trouble. She felt trapped in a cage of frost and anxiety, her body shivering from more than the cold. Then, in the deep dark of midnight, the sound of hoofbeats broke the silence. They came fast, heavy, and deliberate. Her heart skipped, then raced. She rushed to the door and opened it just enough to see a lone figure, riding through the snow, dust trailing behind him like a shadow clinging to the moonlight. The man wore a coat dusted with ice, a hat pulled low, and a scarf hiding the lower half of his face. His horse snorted, stamping in the cold, and when he dismounted, Mary Ann's breath caught in her throat. This was no polite neighbor. This was a man used to the harshness of the land, someone who commanded silence and respect by sheer presence. He approached her slowly, boots crunching over the frozen ground, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravelly and commanding. "Mary Ann Collins?" Her throat tightened. She nodded. "Get up," he said, holding out a gloved hand. "You're coming home." For a moment she thought she had imagined him. Her legs trembled as she stepped outside, the snow biting at her ankles, and she realized she hadn't felt warmth in days, had not known relief from the gnawing despair of hunger. He offered no explanations, only a quiet, unshakable certainty. She noticed the lines on his face, the eyes that had seen too much, the jaw set like iron. He said nothing more, simply mounted his horse and waited, trembling, hungry, and confused. She climbed up behind him, her shawl held tight, and let the horse carry her out of the empty town and toward something unknown, but infinitely better than the cold. Emptiness she had endured. The ride was long, through the black expanse of snow and hills. The wind whipped at her face, stinging, but the presence of the man beside her was a constant anchor. She dared no questions at first, afraid of breaking the fragile thread that kept her moving forward. Hours passed in silence, the sound of the horse's hooves the only rhythm, the only promise that she was no longer alone. By dawn, her body ached from hunger, and her mind raced with the possibilities. Where was he taking her? Was he really Boone Hartley or someone else entirely? Finally, they arrived at a sprawling ranch, half hidden by the snow. smoke curling from chimneys into the pale morning sky. The man dismounted and held out his hand again, helping her down. The warmth hit her first, the scent of wood smoke, of cooking meat, of life thriving even in the dead of winter. He led her inside, and she saw the kitchen table set with food, steaming bowls of stew and fresh bread, a stark contrast to the emptiness she had known. "Sit," he said simply. "Eat. You've been through enough." Marianne sank into the chair, tears streaming freely as hunger and relief collided violently in her chest. She ate greedily, every bite a rebellion against the suffering she had endured, every swallow a testament to survival. He watched her silently, his expression unreadable but not unkind. When she finally looked up, he said, "You're safe now. That's all that matters tonight." For the first time in days, she believed it. The storm outside raged on, but inside there was light, warmth, and the undeniable sense that she had been claimed by something stronger than despair. Boone Hartley, whoever he was, had arrived in the cold darkness and drawn her back from the edge of loneliness. And in that moment, Marianne understood something she had never believed possible. Sometimes, salvation came not in letters, not in promises, but in the determined arrival of a man who refused to leave you behind. The next days unfolded like a slow dawn, each moment dripping with tension and the unspoken question of trust. Marianne Collins remained cautious, her eyes wary of every creak in the cabin, every shadow in the barn, every movement across the snow-dusted porch. Boone Hartley, as he finally allowed her to call him, did not speak much, and when he did, his words were deliberate, measured, as if each one weighed more than gold. He fed her, clothed her, and offered warmth, but he did not explain the absence, the late arrival, the weeks she had spent in starvation and fear. She noticed the scars on his hands, the marks that hinted at violence, at confrontations with men who had underestimated him, and she wondered if she had been saved from a fate harsher than hunger. On the third night after her arrival, the wind picked up, shrieking through the trees, rattling the windows. Marianne sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, trying to calm the tremors that still shook her body from the long ride. Boone entered silently, his boots crunching softly on the wooden floor, and without a word he placed a blanket over her shoulders. "Rest," he said, and for the first time, she allowed herself to lean into that quiet authority, to accept that someone else's strength could become her own. Yet danger never slept for long in Dry Creek or its surrounding valleys. A week passed, and with it came the subtle signs of men who had noticed Boone's absence, or perhaps Marianne's. Tracks in the snow suggested watchers. Faint whispers reached her ears at the edge of the barn. Boone observed them with a calm that made her pulse race. He was prepared, and every subtle action he took reminded her that the world outside could be cruel, but he had mastered it. One evening she found him loading guns with meticulous precision, checking their barrels, oiling the mechanisms, and she realized that she was not just a guest on a ranch, she was under the protection of a man who would defend her at all costs. Marianne's curiosity finally overpowered her fear. "Why didn't you come for me sooner?" she asked, the words spilling before caution could stop them. His hands froze mid-motion and he turned to her, eyes dark and unreadable. "I came as soon as I could," he said finally. "It wasn't safe. I wasn't going to risk you, not then. The town—" He shook his head, leaving the sentence hanging like smoke. She didn't press further, realizing the truth of it. He had fought through dangers she could not imagine, and the weeks of starvation were his torment as much as hers. Christmas. Eve returned with a heavy sky and snow thick enough to blanket the hills in white. Marianne dressed in the warmest clothes. Boone had found for her and followed him outside. They rode together again, but this time, the journey carried a different weight, one of purpose rather than mere survival. Boone led her to a hidden valley, a place she had never seen, where the wind was still and the snow glistened like scattered diamonds. There, a small cabin waited, newly built, smoke curling from its chimney, a place of true refuge. She understood then that he had risked everything to create a sanctuary, a space where hunger, fear, and loneliness could not touch her again. As they approached, Boone stopped the horse and dismounted. He helped her down, and this time, his eyes held a softness that contradicted the hard edges of his face. "This is home," he said, and she felt the weight of every lonely night, every unanswered letter, every cold wind vanish like smoke in the firelight. He handed her a bundle of supplies, and she finally allowed herself to look around, To see that the valley was hers as much as it was his, that survival had turned into possibility, that the terror of the past could give way to hope. Dinner that night was quiet, but filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of shared hardship. They ate by candlelight, the flames reflecting in their eyes, and Marianne realized that the hunger that had gnawed at her for weeks was not only physical but a craving for trust, for protection, for someone to act when the world would not. Boone's steady presence, his unwavering determination to reach her, had filled that void in a way that food alone never could. Later, when she finally rested, Boone settled near the fire with a gun across his lap. The vigilance in his posture a reminder that safety was hard won. Marianne curled under the blankets, her mind replaying the last few weeks. From the bleakest moments in Dry Creek to this valley of quiet snow and warmth, she understood the truth of survival in the West. It was not merely about enduring hunger or cold or solitude. It was about the people who could make you believe, if only for a moment, that you would be protected, that someone would come even when all hope seemed gone. Marianne slept that night with a sense of peace that had been alien to her before, the kind of peace that comes after terror, after desperation, after the kind of hunger that gnaws not just at the body but at the soul. Boone watched her, a quiet guardian, knowing that the world outside the valley would always be harsh, but here tonight at least she was safe. And in the silence of the snow and the glow of the fire, she finally allowed herself to believe in the promise of home, in the unspoken bond between two people forged in hardship, and in the shocking, fierce, undeniable relief that came from being claimed by someone who refused to let her suffer alone.